If you were not here last week, you'll know that I was teaching in Marty's absence, and he is still absent, so I'm still teaching. And we are looking in the book of Matthew. Last week we stopped at about the 11th chapter, verse 6, and we'll be resuming there a little bit later. However, when Marty asked me to teach, he said that if I wanted to go somewhere else a little bit, I could. And I think because of the proximity of where we are in the book of Matthew, that we will do that as it relates to the sheet that you've just received, which moves us past the 11th chapter over to the 12th chapter. And we will be looking at verse 40 in just a moment of Matthew 12, and that will relate to the sheet you've just received. I'm doing this because, number one, I had this material already worked up. I had given Marty a copy of it, and it also is an area that could be a problem in your study with someone if they happen to be a biblical critic and like to find something in there that they think isn't correct, or at least what's the answer to this. And maybe with what we're going to do in the next few moments, we'll try to hit this fairly rapidly and enable you to do some other study, or you can ask me questions at the end or later if you have more study and then wonder about something related to what I'm about to open up. I think that's enough confusion about what I'm talking about. Let's get to it. Matthew 12, verse 40, they were urging Jesus again, trying to help him know what to do, as if they knew more than he did. But in verse 40, he gives an answer to them that is going to be the part of our study. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. There's other thoughts that he gives there, but right there's the problem. The reason that's a problem is because the expression in Mark, the 15th chapter, verse 42, if you want to turn there, Luke 23rd chapter, verse 54, John the 19th chapter, verse 31, all three mention in regard to the day that Jesus died that it was the day of the preparation. And it even adds the next day was the Sabbath. Well, it's common knowledge that in Genesis 2, verse 1 and 2, God sanctified the Sabbath. Don't try to make too much out of that at that point, incidentally, because there's no indication that Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, any of them kept the Sabbath. So God didn't, from the very beginning, as some teach, that he sanctified that day and we still ought to be meeting on the Sabbath, which is Saturday and not Sunday. That's some of the background problem. And these 3 verses I mentioned is where they would go to show that the day of preparation was before the Sabbath. Therefore, the day Jesus died, on the day of preparation, was on Friday. And little booklet, even like this calendar, pocket calendar that I have, December, or in 2018 in this, you would find that on April the 14th was Good Friday. Special day. And if you look in 2018, this year, on March the 30th was Good Friday, and it's listed that way along with Christmas Day and Thanksgiving Day and Good Friday. And at that time, each year, somewhere around those dates, you will find that there are special services, the people have extracurricular activities at the churches in order to celebrate Good Friday, the day that Jesus died, because that was a day of preparation before the Sabbath. Well, the problem is he wasn't buried till that night. Now, get 3 nights out of Friday night, Saturday night, and on what day did he arise? First day, Sunday. Well, then you've got, he was in the tomb on Friday night, Saturday night. That's just 2. He was in there, of course, Friday, Saturday, and then he arose on the first day, but he was in the tomb part of the 3rd day, and it's common knowledge that if you're in a part of a day, you're in that day. So there'd be 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But Good Friday just leaves 2 nights. So critics come along and they say Jesus had it mixed up when he said 3 days and 3. Well, you know, Jesus didn't. But what's the answer? Now, that's what this is all about, and we'll try to highlight that as quickly as we can, 2 or 3 different ways. First of all, drop down about the middle of the page. When Jesus died, you see there in the sheet that you received after all the numbers, was buried and arose. And I'm not going to read all those passages now. You can do that on your own, but what you have beginning in Matthew 26 and verse 1 and 2 would be the beginning of the taking him, putting him on trial, first of all, before the Jews or the Sanhedrin. And if you look at those other passages, you've got also that he was then, after that, as given really in Matthew 27, 1 and 2, they took him next to Pilate, and he was tried there. And then Pilate, finding out that he was in the geographic jurisdiction of Herod, he sent him to Herod, and that's listed there in those passages. And then Herod, after he spent time hearing Jesus, trying Jesus, sent him back to Pilate, and that's there in that last part, Luke 23, 12 through 24, or John 19, 1 through 16. All of that was Jesus being put on trial. I'm only going to look at one passage in all of this, just for time's sake. In the passage there in John 19, turn to John 19 if you would, and we'll look at one verse, verse 14. John 19, 14. Now it was the preparation, the day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, that would be at noontime by Jewish measuring time, he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered and said, "We have no king but Caesar." And it was tilting in such a dramatic and powerful way on the part of a public response and reaction that Pilate gave in, had Christ scourged and beaten, and then was crucified that day. But there's the day, verse 14. It was at the 6th hour that those thoughts occurred, and then shortly thereafter he delivered him up to be crucified, and then he was later dead that day. There's the background. Now then, what are we going to do, though, about Jesus' statement in Matthew 12:40, 3 nights and 3 days? To get that answer, come back up toward the about third part of the page to Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, and we will read some verses in regard to the Passover week. There was a Passover day, but there was an entire week in which they were to eat unleavened bread, and other things are stated, and we're going to look at just some of that. Leviticus 23, starting in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, these are my feasts." And he is about to give them. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath. Now that's just the regular through the week, Saturday, seventh day, Sabbath day. That became special. It became special actually in a law pattern in Exodus, the 20th chapter, if you wanted the verses 8 through 11, or in Deuteronomy, the 5th chapter, verses 12 through 15. God laid down the law through Moses to Israel. You remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And that was a holy convocation. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Verse 4. Now he goes past that day, actually, and says, these are the feasts of the Lord. Notice the plurality. Holy convocations which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month, the first month, is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. And I said, on the first day you shall have a holy convocation. If you go back to verse 3, a holy convocation is also called a Sabbath. Now, the seventh day Sabbath was in the week, but this one is on the first day of the Passover week, was to be a Sabbath, a holy convocation. And it adds, you shall do no customary work on it. Verse 8. But you shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord for 7 days. Now the seventh day, first day and now the seventh day, shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So there were 2 Sabbath days in the Passover week. And that is touched on. I might add, if you want to get some more information on this holy convocation and it being a Sabbath, and it's a day of the month, like the first day of the Passover week, but he said it's the 14th and 15th and then the 7th day. The reason I'm mentioning that part is because when you have a day of a month that is a special day, it changes the day of the week from year to year. For example, in this little booklet, I just looked up Christmas Day, December 25th. It's always the 25th. Well, that turned out to be Monday in 2017. But Christmas Day, the 25th in 2018, was Tuesday. And next year, 2019, it'll be Wednesday, and so it goes. And it's that way with the day of the week. So you see, these two Sabbaths wouldn't come on the seventh day. They were a day of the month, the 14th, 15th, and 21st. And two of them were special holy convocation days or Sabbath days. Now, with that in mind, I was going to mention to you, incidentally, later in the 23rd chapter of Revelation, I think I have it listed there, 26 through 32, you've got a discussion of the Day of Atonement, and down in that, if I read it, you'd find that that's in the 7th month and 10th day of the month, and it's called a Sabbath. But it wouldn't be on a Saturday necessarily. It'd be on whatever day of the month it was that year. That's the change. And that explains, now back to John 19 and verse 31 that I mentioned to you, was one of the places where it mentioned that it's a day of the preparation, and it's connected with the Passover. John 19, 31. This now when Christ had died and they were trying to get him buried before sundown, for another day would be starting then, which would have been a Sabbath. Verse 31, therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. John's the only one that mentions it being a high day. The Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, and now you read the rest of the context, and it was then later that day that they put him in Joseph's new tomb on what it looks like would be the end of the day, Friday, and as Saturday was beginning. So, with that in mind, we now have the dilemma of Matthew 12 and verse 40, 3 days and 3 nights. It's interesting to me, this book is quite a fairly scholarly presentation. It's a harmony, and there's a lot of detail in this harmony, listing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John through the life of Christ, starting from the very beginning. But there's one section that starts over on page 182 that was the final week of Christ's life. And that goes to page 250. So actually you've got about 68 pages in here on just the last week. And he'll give the parallel in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John of Jesus' events day by day, starting Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. It's interesting when you come to Wednesday on page 210, it says no record. And that isn't just in this one. My guess is if you have a harmony at home, you can go look it up. They have the events of what Jesus did that last week on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and then being in the tomb and all. But Wednesday, they say they don't have any record of what he did. Well, they do, but it just wasn't how it fits with Good Friday. Just move Thursday's events back to Wednesday and Friday's events back to Thursday, and you've got all that Jesus did for the entire week. And, well, how do you get the preparation day for the Sabbath, though? Now, John is the one that gives us the expression that it was a high day. And I did a little checking just for the fun of it, I guess. But anyhow, I found out the King James, the American Standard, the New American Standard, and the English Standard Version all translate that to high day. But here are some of the translations of some of the other ones, like J.B. Phillips, and he even states in what he gave as a translation of the New Testament that he's giving a paraphrase, but he said, a particularly important Sabbath is the way he put it. Now, all that's from one Greek word, megas, M-E-G-A-S, great. I'll give the definition as given in lexicons in a moment. In the Douay version, Latin translation by the Catholics, they give it as a solemn day. Another, the New Life version, and it just, well, I hope you don't buy one and go buy it. It's not a good translation. Here's what they wrote on that one word, high day. It's a commentary more than it is a translation, is what it adds up to. They said this was the day before the special religious gathering to remember how the Jews left Egypt. That had been the Passover. That's part right, is right. But it gets all that from one word. The next day was the day of the rest and the great day of the religious gathering. Now all that is written in as John 19:31. And then I've got another translation that came out about 10 years ago. It's called The Message. Some places it's pretty good. But it has, instead of high day, it was a high holy day that year. It added all that in there that year. Well, I think that's getting pretty close to it. I want to just briefly touch on the Greek lexicons. I've got one by Robinson, came out in the 1800s. And he says that the meaning of the term was great, or he gives long. You see how megas could be long if he was measuring something, great length, of a day of celebration, a great solemn day. J.H. Thayer states that the Greek word means to express totality, hence great. Totality, covering all of it. More extraordinary. And then he had solemn and sacred. That's what megas means. Arnott Gingrich in their translation says, of the Sabbath day that begins a festal period. Now that's a pretty good definition as it fits John 19:31. That's what it was. It was a special day. And then it adds the great day of the festival. Well, when was the festival? It was that holy convocation at the beginning of the week. And it would change just like Christmas Day does from year to year. So what happened? Surely the day that Christ died was a special Sabbath, not the seventh day Sabbath, and it was Friday. And the next day was the 7-day Sabbath. You had two going together. Sooner or later, they'd always do that every few years. And John just happens to be the one that put in that little parenthetical expression. And this man would have no problem then with Wednesday being no record. You do have a record. You just got to take Thursday and put it back to Wednesday, and Friday back to Thursday, and then let the two Sabbaths come along. And what do you come up with? You have it as given down there in the chart. Jesus was buried as the Sabbath was drawing nigh. And so the Friday Sabbath, the high day Sabbath, he was buried Thursday evening. And then he was in the tomb Friday and Saturday and rose the first day, 3 days. He was in the tomb Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday. Well, if any questions on that, I ran over and I certainly didn't look at all the passages you have there to do your research if you want to do it further, but thought it might be good to cover that in case someone comes to you someday and said, well, why did Jesus stay 3 days and 3 nights? Because it was 3 days and 3 nights. That's why he said it. But it's not Good Friday. And we are traditionally, I'm saying we in a general sense of all those that claim to follow Christ, we're traditionally following just like the calendars give it, that Good Friday was the day Christ died. No, he died on Thursday. And, well, any questions? Yes.
Just thought I'd make a mention of the fact that when we as English-speaking people have a different calendar than the Jews had at that time. And we know that it says in the beginning, it was the evening and the morning of the first day. And so we count time in a different manner and means than they did.
That's right there. The day would begin at evening.
The day began at evening.
Yeah.
And so that the evening and the morning were the first day. And a lot of people that are reading do not take into account, as you said, you know, that we're not counting from morning to evening. We're counting from evening to morning for the Jews.
So, hope that little wrinkle, if you ever have to deal with it, might be clear to you.
So you're saying that there were 2 Sabbaths?
2 Sabbaths. One was a special Passover Sabbath day that was a holy convocation, and the next one happened to be the regular 7-day Sabbath. They just had back to back. Had to be that year. And then you do have a record of what Jesus was doing every day that last week, because the gap Wednesday no record is filled in with Thursday's events. All right, any other question or thought? Well, let's get back now to our survey of Matthew in the 11th chapter. Last week we had noted that John sent 2 disciples. Remember, John is imprisoned at that time. Sent 2 to check and find out if Jesus was really the Messiah. And I covered passages last week that lead me to believe that he was not so much interested in finding out himself. I think he knew who Christ was. He not only was a cousin in the flesh, but he had the thought in John 1:29 and other passages that I gave last week, special signs given to him at the baptism of Jesus also, the dove coming down, and saw the Spirit descending as a dove upon him. And the voice from above said, "This is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased." But there was skepticism in a lot of people as to who Christ was. And apparently John, now in prison, knowing that he might die, and I might mention in Matthew 14, he was beheaded and did die, he was concerned about the others. And that's the first 6 verses that we looked at last week in Matthew 11. Beginning in verse 7 down through 15, you have a beautiful tribute to John the Baptist by Jesus. And there are 2 or 3 passages in that reading that might be worthy of our taking a little time. Verse 10, for example, is a quote from Malachi, the 3rd chapter, verse 1. Jesus quotes, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. That was the work that John was to do. And then Jesus adds in verse 11, assuredly I say to you, among those born of women there has not one greater than John the Baptist, or risen one greater than John the Baptist. Now here's the part that I think might be of interest, and I'll let one of you explain it to me. But he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Now Jesus certainly is a proper reader of people, and he said there's none greater than John. Right after that he says, but whoever is least in the kingdom is greater. Who wants to give me an explanation of how one would be greater? Yes, good, Johnny.
In this sense here, he's talking about John the Baptist being born of woman of the flesh. Also, we're talking about Christ being born of woman of the flesh. But Christ is holy from the Father. The difference is the spirituality of Christ and the humanity of John the Baptist in the physical.
That's getting pretty close probably to it. Johnny, what did you start to give us?
Well, because of the gifts that we receive by being joint heirs of the kingdom, when Christ rose, we and the kingdom was established. We've got everlasting life. We've got forgiveness. I don't think John the Baptist, all those and all his followers, didn't have that yet.
Well, now they had forgiveness because he was baptizing them for remission of sins. Now, in the same sense that people in the Old Covenant era, by offering sacrifices, had a forgiveness. But you're touching on the idea, really, this is a great tribute to the kingdom and its greatness. Was John ever a member of the church or in the kingdom himself? I don't see how he could be, because it didn't start till some time after that. Had Jesus died at that point? No, Jesus is the one saying this. So number one, John wasn't even a member of the church or in the kingdom himself. And it's a tribute to the greatness of the kingdom if you get in there. Now then, well, what's so great about that? I've been knowing some of those Church of Christ people, and I don't think they're very great. I've even preached sermons on the 5 P's as it relates to the church. It's made up of God's precepts, and in those precepts there are principles about how to live. There are practices like the Lord's Supper, baptism, and praying, and other things we are to do. Go preach to every creature. And then there are promises, and they are rich. I'm going away that I might come receive you unto myself, and those things. So you've got the precepts and the principles and the practices and the promises. And other P is the people. You know what's the problem in the church? That last one. All the others are excellent. And so Jesus is dealing with the greatness of the kingdom. I might just touch right quickly on one or two things. Number one, not only was John not in the kingdom himself, and we can be, and most of you, I guess maybe all of you are, but there's a greater message to proclaim. Did John ever preach the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ? No. You check John's ministry, and he hit pretty heavy on the sins of the people, and that's why they headed for the water, to get rid of their sins. But the thought that's in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4 or 5, where Paul said, I make known to you the gospel that I preached unto you, which also you believe, wherein also you stand, if you are then sincere in your belief, and so forth. And then he said what it was. How that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, was buried, rose again from the dead on the 3rd day, according to the Scriptures. John never did preach that. And when he went out preaching, he couldn't because it hadn't happened yet. Now, it might have been prophetically mentioned, but it wasn't all clear until Jesus actually died. And then Peter, on the day of Pentecost, did preach that good message. And then there was a greater salvation to offer. Preach it to how many? It's big because of how many could be saved. Preach it to every creature. Every creature. He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. Mark 16, 15 and 16 and that. And yeah, someone... Yeah. I still remember hearing Brother Frank Pack in Abilene, Texas, spoke on John the Baptist. It's one of the best sermons I've ever heard on John in my life. Man, it was rich. And he's dealing with what Billy's bringing up there, and that is the fantastic response that John brought about. It says all Jerusalem and Judea, they came out to hear that man. And Billy's right. They came to him in the wilderness with all that crazy dress he had on and what he is eating. But they listened. That man had to be a powerful preacher. But he didn't have the message you and I do. That's the big difference. And that's why you and I ought to be excited that one as great as John was, so that Jesus said that none has arisen that's greater than that man. He said he's more than a prophet. Later, Lord willing, I'll be speaking about Jeremiah, just covering the books of the Bible on that Wednesday night series later. Jeremiah, I'm impressed with that man. But Jesus said John was greater. Now, what I'm trying to do is help you in your own heart. Not go around cocky or arrogant. God forbid you do that. But with a flutter and a spring in your step, and thank God that you're in Christ. Hope you get that, because it's greater than John ever had. Well, let's move on. In this context, there's another statement here in this portrayal where really John is being lifted up high. Look in verse 14. Verse 13 says, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John, and if you are willing to receive it, he is the Elijah who is to come. Now, you may want to put a star by that in your Bible, or at least in your head. What verse did I read? It's Matthew the 11th chapter, what verse? Verse 14. If you want a clear statement that fulfills Malachi, the 4th chapter, verse 5, that said there was Elijah who was to come, that's the best place in the 66 books of the Bible to know who that Elijah was. Because Jesus said it so clear and plain in that one verse. So Matthew 11:14, you might want to kind of peg that one as we go through the rest of this chapter. He plainly said that John is the fulfillment of Malachi 4 and 5, or he is the Elijah who is to come. Now, verse 12, let's get one other verse here, because it again is a little bit strange in phrasing. Jesus said, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. What does that mean to you? In what sense was the kingdom being taken by force?
It's hard to understand that a kingdom is going to be taken by force when it's not even in existence yet. But yet, John's preaching and teaching is being taken by force because they're going to crucify Christ. They're going to take him by force, and he is the founder of the kingdom.
Yes, all right. And that's pretty well the idea. If you went back in the 10th chapter, about verses 16 through 22, he mentioned about how much persecution they were going to go through. I mentioned a moment ago Matthew 14. In that chapter, I believe it's the first 12 verses, John the Baptist was beheaded. Now, that's pretty violent. That's not getting into boxing rings, boxing gloves, and going 2 or 3 rounds. When you take off someone's head, that's just about as brutal as you can be to a human being. If there's anything more brutal, maybe to be what Christ went through in being crucified. But that, and then there are other verses like that. You might look in the, let me see. I believe it's verses 65, Matthew 26 is the chapter, incidentally. Let's just read that because it's about the best summary I know of. Verses 65 down through around verse 68. That's just 2 or 3 verses. We can cover them pretty quickly, and it says a lot in a few verses. Then the high priest tore his clothes. That's when Jesus was standing before the Jewish tribunal. He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? And they answered and cried out. Here's what Jesus faced that night. He's deserving of death. And then they spit in his face and beat him. Others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ." Mockery. Who is the one who struck you? And there are other verses you're familiar of that shows that at this time. In the book I wrote on Restoration Revival, I have a chapter entitled, "Thy Kingdom Come." And in that, I picked up a quote somewhere. I've forgotten right now what the source was. But it's right. It mentions the Greek term basileia for kingdom. The primary meaning of kingdom is authority. And did you catch a moment ago the 5 P's I had? Think of the authority that's behind the precepts, the principles, the practices, the promises. There's the heart of the kingdom right there. Now the other part's what? People. Now the violence was being done to whom? To people. And the kingdom hadn't come yet in reality. That would begin on the day of Pentecost. But the framework of it was where? Through what Christ taught. And especially think of Matthew 28:18, after he had died, was buried, and had arisen. All authority has been given unto me where? In heaven and on earth. That's a kingdom. There's your authority and power. Now, that is what this is referring to. As Billy said, the church hadn't begun, the kingdom wasn't there, but what they were doing as it related to Christ's followers, as to John, and would do to Jesus, all of these things were violent. And that's what it's talking about. I heard that buzzer buzz, and I didn't get as far as I wanted to. In verses 16 through 19, I might mention primarily what you have is a listing of cultural conflict. And I mention that because we have a bundle of it right now in our own country and in the world. But John came, Jesus said, I'm in the wrong location now, I'm back to it. Matthew 11. John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he's got a demon. Jesus said the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a wine bibber, a friend of tax collectors. I've got about 4 passages I intend for us to study in regard to wisdom, especially in 1 Corinthians. I'll just mention, starting in verse 17. It talks about the wisdom of the world, and that's what you've got here. Here are John and Jesus, both of them, presenting truth, fitting into God's plan. Jesus perfectly and John quite well. And what's this riffraff around the edges talking? Demon, wine bibber, and a glutton. One did one thing, he's wrong. Someone else does Jesus a little differently, and he was wrong. I think of what Brother Homer Haley once gave us as an illustration. He said, a fellow called and said, I want to borrow your rope so I can go tie up my milk. And the man said, you can't tie up milk with a rope. And he wouldn't let him have his rope. He said, if you don't want to do something, one excuse is as good as another. Well, that's about the way people reason. One response doesn't make any difference how you come. If they don't like what you're teaching, you're a demon or you're something. And that is covered in verses 16 through 19. Very confused culture. I might mention also Proverbs 3 I'd hope to get to, 13 through 22, and especially Proverbs, the 8th chapter, has a beautiful study about wisdom. And Jesus said here in regard to their wisdom, but wisdom is justified by her children. Now 1 Corinthians 1 touches on the wisdom of the world, and it's pretty sad. Really reminds me of the expression Proverbs 14:12, there's the way it seems right to man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. We get things so mixed up in our country now, the mixed up things in regard to the churches, so many sad things, and it's because we've got the wisdom of the world too much, but the wisdom of God in Proverbs 3 and Proverbs 8 is so beautiful as to what it can do and will do and continues to do. And what does James 1:5 say? If anyone lacks what? Wisdom. Let him ask of God, who gives to all freely. I hope we'll all get all of God's wisdom we can. And we'll have a lot more smiles. And we'll behave a little bit better. You're dismissed. I think our time's up.